Hey, DJ.
Hey, Dimitro.
Alrighty, hi everyone. This is January 6th, 2022. Just doing a quick distribution team demo slash discussion today about our NGINX fork of the upstream Helm chart from the Kubernetes team. It's been a long running component of GitLab that we use for Ingress, and for the Helm chart specifically, for a while we've been maintaining a fork of it. That's a loose term. Really what we're doing is copy pasting the code from GitHub into our GitLab Helm chart project on GitLab itself, and doing our best to at least maintain a list of modifications that we've made to it to make it compatible with GitLab itself, primarily GitLab shell, but there's also some other modifications in there like common labels and things like that. So I'll share my screen. The context for the call today is that about a month ago, Gerard started this MR for the NGINX upgrade. And I think about a year ago was the last time we did the upgrade, and I did that one up to 0.41.2. It's just a really painful process. The NGINX Helm chart itself is not huge, but there's quite a bit of configuration in there, and keeping a mental model of what's changing in the upstream chart as well as what's changing in the GitLab chart and how to integrate those two is pretty challenging, especially with the Helm templating language and use of template inheritance and so forth. So, um, it works, but it's definitely not ideal, and it takes up a lot of cycles for the team, and it's really tough to review. If I go into the changes here, there's almost 1,000 line changes, and it's not just quick edits of modifying values. It's the changes get pretty involved, and so as a result it's pretty easy to miss things. And every time we do, I know that after this one we had 2 or 3 MRs that we had to submit patches and roll them back to previous releases, and the same happened last year when I did it. So for the most part we can test, but with so many possible configuration values, there's always a chance that there's some edge case that wasn't covered that we need to fix. So as I was reviewing this, just on the side while I was waiting for pipelines to run, I just opened up a demo MR of what it would look like to remove all of the copy and pasted NGINX code from our GitLab Helm chart and just see what happens, and see to the extent to which, with normal values passing that any user could provide, how close we can get to feature parity. So obviously we won't get to 100%. Not everything will work. The NGINX upstream chart isn't quite flexible enough for our unique needs here. But that being said, the state of this MR today is that I took out all of the NGINX ingress files here, so all these are deleted. And then, I just updated specs to change new values, expectations, and things like that. And then, so most of what's changed here is just in the values. So now I provide the port 22 for the TCP config map. This value may look weird in a values file, but on the NGINX end in that template, it actually calls TPL on whatever value you pass to it. So if you hand it an actual template, it will actually render that. So that portion of it is flexible. Ideally, we would pass gitlab.shell.port as a template here too, which does work for the config map actually, but this value is also used in the NGINX controller deployment and daemon set to expose those ports on the deployment itself. And so that does not provide TPL calculations. So it just renders an error if you provide a template there. So, and then the other thing is that the ingress class resource, that is a cluster scoped resource. Therefore, we're going to need it to have a namespace prefix. But again, that template does not support passing in templates, something like this. So we'll need to patch that as well. So anyway, with just minimal configuration here, all of this actually passes in the pipeline. I'd push some changes up just to rebase today. after the break. So I think some things are breaking GKE passed, but I've got an instance running here. So it's pretty boring. NGINX looks the same. Obviously, it's just coming from our upstream Helm chart now. The only difference is it's now being pulled in just like any other dependency from the upstream. So Gerard's most recent MR update was to pull in chart version 406. So I just pulled that same version. And then, like I said, really only had to modify this to provide a TCP config map for port 22. So everything works. I was able to get to the instance, the default monitoring project. I just added my SSH keys to the instance, and I was able to clone it, which you can see down here in the bottom right. So obviously the minimal config works fine. Obviously it's not ideal to be hard coding port 22 here. This should really be pulling from the GitLab shell template. But it's not too bad. The other one that's dangling here is that one of our overrides is to, in the NGINX service, rather than setting the load balancer IP, we actually share external IP. So if you were to set global.host.external IP, that value would be used in the NGINX service to ensure all the routing works quickly. Webcam thing just fell down. So, very minimal patches. Obviously, this is doable, just requires a little bit of duplication in the values that you provide. I would effectively, what I'm doing right now really is also providing global.host.domain external IP, and then I have to specify it again in NGINX because it's not sharing that value yet. So that's really the context of it. I see a couple options going forward. One is to, and I kind of outlined this in the MR as well. Back to overview. So the first one is to quote unquote fork, kind of a, today we call it a fork, really. It's just copy pasting code. This would be closer to a true fork in that we would actually go to GitHub and check out the version of the NGINX chart that we want, and then push that to GitLab to a separate project. And then, either fork that into our NGINX fork or just push the changes to that project itself, and then vendor it from GitLab into this GitLab Helm chart. As far as I know, that would all be manual. I don't know of a way to maintain a fork from GitHub to GitLab. I know that you can import projects from GitHub, but I don't believe that there's mirroring available for that. If anybody knows if that's possible, definitely correct me. And then, of course, the changes are a little more involved because, we have to go manually push those changes over as a merge request rather than, just being able to open an MR from the fork. So I'll pause there. I see Dimitro's unmuted.
I did experiment with NGINX tracking, and it actually is doing it. So you can track specific branches, if I remember correctly, and then your local branches remain as is, and you can actually, that's how you maintain, like you fork off the main branch upstream, and then you just maintain your feature branches or release branches downwards, and you keep on reapplying things moving forward. So it's a possible scenario. That's what I was experimenting with. It's just like, do we want to do it? Because actually, I still think it's a better approach than what we're doing now, period. So it's like, this is not a question here. It's more of a, okay, so do we want to do that, or go your number 2 option and just engage fully with the upstream and probably just get it done? But I remember vaguely somebody mentioning that we did approach upstream with our changes previously, and they did not take those changes, but maybe it's my memory failing me. I can't remember.
Yeah, we should definitely share that context out if there's some historical, because yeah, if it's like a no-go and we already know it, then we don't probably, then that kind of tips the balance towards some alternate solution, right? But if it's like,
Yeah.
hey, there's new maintainers and they totally understand what we're trying to do, in that path, is shorter as potentially, then it feels like, and then I think maybe, and this is like maybe a third option, is do, both, right? Work to get the changes upstream and then kind of ease our pain, in some way to minimize the impact until if it's going to be a year or 2 years before we feel like it'll be upstream. It's just kind of my high level thoughts on it. That
Yeah, I think there's pros and cons to either approach. And to your point, I think we could probably do some mixture of both. The pros of our like kind of maintaining a more true fork in GitLab is that, if we need to make changes, they can happen much more quickly because we don't have to wait for upstream to accept them. So that's pretty beneficial. The downside, of course, is there's still a little bit of a manual process. Someone's going to have to go to GitHub and check out a new release and push it as a merge request to our fork. And then submitting our changes upstream. The pros are that's really good stewards of open source, and it could make changes shareable. I think a good portion of our forked changes could be generic enough to not be GitLab specific. For the most part, the primary one is just supporting an external TCP config map, which is very easy to implement as an optional default, an optional implementation, and therefore everyone with the defaults just keeps existing behavior.
Yeah, and I think it's those kinds of pieces that we need to highlight in
Yep,
our
exactly.
discussion with the upstream folk. Is like, hey, we're not changing the existing behavior at all. We're allowing this new feature and propose it as a new value added to the product, as opposed to like we want to manipulate what's already there to work for us, right?
Right. Yeah. Because really, the scope of what we need for the most part is just the concept of extra labels, extra args, extra config maps, that kind of thing. It's all additive and optional for the most part. So to prove that out is why I opened up this MR. I want to actually see what the changes look like that are required to get this to work, and then we can kind of categorize them as candidates for upstream. And if not all of them are, then we'll have to explore the concept of maintaining a fork. But to Dimitro's point, I think option one is doable today. And with a little bit of setup, I think future changes would be so much easier, because today, for the most part, really the only approach that works is to delete all the code from the GitLab Helm chart and paste in the new code from the NGINX, and then go back and reapply all the forked changes. And it's pretty much all manual just because of the nature of that. And so I think, if anything, option one is at least a good improvement, because then it's a real merge
Yeah.
request and we can see the diffs and include or exclude them as needed.
Yeah, I'm aligned with that as well.
Yeah. So that's mostly where we are today. I think it was just encouraging to see that, at least with our defaults, we can vendor the upstream NGINX chart and it can work okay. I think probably most of the time someone's using GitLab shell, they'll be using port 22, but of course we need to support scenarios where that's not the case. And then of course we need to add in more important settings like sharing that external IP with NGINX so DNS is routed correctly. So this is really just a quick discussion. Wanted to introduce this MR and show that we're working on it. Open to any collaboration and thoughts here. I think ideally this MR will probably be closed, but I plan to use it over time, especially if we start a fork like option one suggests. We could vendor the chart from our new fork and test it in this MR and see if we can get all the jobs to pass as expected, which would be really cool. So eventually, I think, just maintaining a fork within GitLab would be a great step forward. And then if any of those changes look like good candidates for submitting to upstream, that would be even better. So that's kind of where we're at today.
An awesome recap. I think I'm glad we captured this. And so now I know we've got a few folks. I tried to socialize this a little bit yesterday with folks on the immediate teams. But now that we've kind of talked about it, added even more context, I think, the MR plus this recording should provide others with a sense of what we're trying to do and what our options might be.
One thing that I did notice with kind of forking and then vendoring in, and that is, if we want to apply additional pipelining on top of this, we have to maintain, like we have to reapply our pipeline to GitLab CI over to the stuff that we're receiving from the upstream, or we just create a brand new project with the pipeline, just the pipeline, and then we operate on the repo where the fork is maintained. And that's what I was kind of tinkering with. I'm not sure, like, I don't think we have anything that does pipeline maintenance in a repo separate from the code. I don't think any of our things live like that. Is anybody aware?
Yeah, I was picturing it as a project in here, and we just create a new NGINX, or maybe we create a new subgroup called forks or something like that. But then that project is just the really simple NGINX chart, and we can make our changes to it. And there's just a simple pipeline that pushes to that project's Helm chart repository.
Yeah.
It's just one option.
Yeah, I like that approach, just to make it modular and isolated as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, it could also make sense to just have one project that is the fork, and we kind of manually push changes over from GitHub, and then create one more project that is our actual fork of it. So basically create a mirror and then fork off of that mirror. At least that way we have kind of separated instances of this is just pure upstream code from GitHub that's mirrored. And then in the second project, we actually forked it and make our changes to it. And that's where the pipeline will exist to actually push up the chart. So might be a nice separation.
Yeah, that would be interesting to kind of tinker with that one.
Yeah. Or maybe someday in the future we'll get GitHub to GitLab mirroring, unless it exists already and I missed it. Don't know.
Yeah, I think the mirroring does work currently. Kind of like Dimitro described. So you can either set it up just to mirror certain branches, or you can have it pull in all branches from the upstream, but you can still have local branches that don't get wiped out during that mirroring as well. So that's how we have a fork of on the Omnibus side of the Omnibus software. It's actually constantly, or a lot of things are being mirrored from upstream for Omnibus, but that piece is actually a mirror and a fork.
Interesting. What's the link for that project? I mean,
It's just called Omnibus. It's not one of your starred ones here. Yeah, GitLab org Omnibus.
GitLab fork of the Omnibus project.
So we set in the project settings, we changed the default branch to be our own version of stable. But if you look at the drop down, it also has upstream master in this case is being pulled in. I think it's just under master.
So is this a built-in feature of the project to pull in those changes, or is there a bot? It looks like this bot might be doing the pushing.
No, it's just pull mirroring set up in the project. This one looks like maybe it's turned off at the moment, but our mirror group for Omnibus, which doesn't do forks but just mirrors, from GitHub is largely from GitHub as well. So we have a whole project of Omnibus mirrors as well. If you take a look at that group, I think the group is build mirrors or Omnibus mirrors in GitLab.
So is that like new project, import project from GitHub? And then there's an option after you authorize it to.
Yeah, so
continue to
every project afterwards has the option to mirror. And we have in GitLab, we have both in enterprise edition, we have push mirrors and pull mirrors. So and that's that's basically how our mirroring for like the dev repos also work as well.
Got it.
Is that we use the mirroring function in GitLab's repository settings.
Awesome. So we could set that up to mirror the NGINX chart from GitHub into GitLab, and then we could create a project forked from that mirror.
Yeah, you could do that as well, or you could, because it's really just the repository that's mirrored. So the project itself is like issues and other stuff aren't copied
Yeah.
aren't persisted during that. So you really can do things like change the default branch to be our own forked default branch. So you can like you can do a mirror and a fork in the same project if you want, as long as you never reuse the same branch names as upstream, which might mean your future branches always have to be prefixed with like GitLab or something like that. But if you
I can share my screen just to show you the mirroring option. That's from that project right there.
So you can tell it what refs, git repository URL, mirror repository. You mirror the whole thing.
Give
or
divergent
just-
refs and mirror only protected branches. So you can actually just specify what do you want to mirror.
Yeah, so because Dimitro already has set up the pull mirror, he's only getting the option here for the push mirror, which has a few different options. But you're seeing, yeah, the options here for the push mirror. But you see, scroll down a little bit, he actually already has set up the pull
Yeah.
mirror.
That's the guy.
Yeah,
So you
so you
can't
can
see
only
those
set up
settings
one
anymore.
of each type. So that's why he no longer has the option to see the settings for.
Oh, that's what it is. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you click on the main project, it's got all the branches from the upstream project.
Yeah. Should.
And then
let's go here. Take a look. Yep. Yep. Right there.
and then I'm guessing it checks every. I guess you probably set the interval, huh?
I don't remember if I set the interval or it actually was set for me, but something that like I do receive notifications every so often.
Yeah, so the interval is set at the GitLab instance level, and it's not like a guaranteed interval. So we have ours running on GitLab.com. They attempt to run every hour,
Got it.
but depending on load, it might be like 3 hours or something like that between syncs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it wouldn't have to be that often. We're mostly getting tagged. We'd branch off of tagged releases.
Yeah, and then yeah, so it runs every hour, all the mirrors, or does best effort to do that. It runs as the GitLab user account that created the mirror. So we usually use in distribution, we have a bot account for mirroring that we typically use for that. So we just log into the bot account to set up the mirroring.
So it's nice that you can do it all together, but I could see it being a little confusing having all the like upstream and local branches on the same project. So maybe it would be better to separate just the fork, I mean, just the mirror, and then fork off of that mirror project. Would you agree, or has it been convenient to work with all in one?
I wouldn't say it's not convenient or inconvenient. I think the thing that helps is, unless you have a really good group names that keeps the mirror out of search, would be just like ending up when you're trying to get to one, ending up in the other. And on the omnibus one, you saw it was just like under the GitLab org group. For historic reasons, we didn't put a lot of good thought into where to put it, and we, at the time when it was mirrored, we didn't have a lot of groups under the GitLab org group. So I would say if you're going to do a mirror, that it would be best to have that in a group that's very clearly named mirror. And then I think having two would be fine. Yeah, I think that's the only downside, is if you have two projects that essentially have the same name.
Yeah, that makes sense. You could probably make the project name suffixed with fork, right? Or do you have to use the upstream project name?
No, you can use a completely different name.
Yeah, that's what I did. Like mine is Diamond NGINX instead of NGINX for the project repo. So
yeah,
it doesn't matter.
So either way, suffix or a separate group. I know sometimes we have to put in requests to create new subgroups, though. Maybe that's only at the GitLab org level. I'm not sure. I think we had to do that for cloud native.
Yeah, I think I can do some, but not all of them. Same with DJ, I think. John.
Okay.
Like for me, the difference between creating a group and creating just a project with a unique suffix is like, are you gonna have more than one
Mhm.
in there? Because if you have a group with only one entry,
Yeah.
it's like, why
it's a
did
little
why did
wasteful.
you create a group? Versus,
I could see us forking others in the future, I guess. We also have cert manager in there, don't we? Don't we kind of maintain a fork of? I think we just have some overrides for the cert manager chart, but we still vendor it.
Well, even for the short-lived stuff, like if we manage to push it upstream, in the meantime, even having it separated and clearly delineated would give people a better sign of what this is, rather than why did you have to reinvent the bicycle?
yeah,
Kind
I
of-
agree. The discoverable aspect of it is nice.
Yeah, it looks like we already created a mirror group for Cloud Native. So in terms of the mirror project, we could probably just nicely go into there.
Yeah, that was its own group, wasn't it? Mirror.
Just going back to the idea of mirroring and then forking, there's another thing that, like, not just a mix of branches and everything that kind of jives with me, and that is the maintenance of our own code that we plugged in there. So the CI code that we will eventually attach to it, because we're going to be using the GitLab CI, not the stuff that the upstream is using, whether it's Travis or whatever that is. So for that reason, it would be much easier, because we can just tinker with the branches here and there, rather than messing up the stuff that is much closer to the upstream. The only, like, yeah, the danger we already floated is the fact that now there are two repos, and which one do you contribute to, and people may get confused.
Yeah. Yeah, my expectation is that I think we'll have to have a fork. The odds of all of our changes being accepted by upstream probably isn't 100%. So I think starting with the fork is a quick way to. Honestly, my main goal is the next time we have to upgrade NGINX, which should not be every year, should probably do a little more frequently than that, is that it's just way easier than it was in the past couple iterations. So however we can iterate on this and make it easier, I think would be a huge help, just so we never have to do it by hand again. So could probably start with a fork, and then we can have further discussion on the details of whether we'll suffix it or put it in a subgroup. But sounds like everybody's in agreement on the general next steps, and
Yeah, I think
it
the
is a lot
main,
easier.
like the first iteration could be just isolating the NGINX into its own repo. Then how is that repo being populated becomes less material to the main project. And then we can work on that in isolation. Just kind of useful first step to me.
Yeah, true. That's an approach too. Cool. Well, I see we're at time. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I think that's I like that conclusion statement that you just made, right? Cool. Can we stop the recording real quick?